I'll never forget the sight of the river that day. The water was red, flowing thick with blood, and the air was heavy with screams and the clash of spears. It wasn't always like this. I remember when that river was just a river, calm, peaceful, a place to catch fish and fill our pots. But on that day, it became something else. It became the line between life and death. I was there when it all started. My name is Zara, and I lived in the village of Matsi. I wasn't anyone special, just a farmer who tried to keep to himself. I had no love for the constant feuds with the village across the river Kuru. Honestly, I didn't even know why we hated them. It was just the way things were. We didn't talk to them. We didn't trade with them. We didn't even look at them if we could help it. But things changed the night I saw her. It was late, and I'd gone to the river to fetch water. The moonlight was bright enough to see by, and I heard soft laughter. At first, I thought it was animals, but then I saw them, a man and a woman. They were sitting by the river, holding hands, whispering to each other like there was no one else in the world. At first, I didn't recognize them, but as I moved closer, I realized who the woman was. It was Zara, the chief's daughter. Everyone in Matsi knew Zara. She was kind and smart, and everyone said she would make a great leader one day. But the man wasn't from Matsi. His clothes, his posture, everything about him screamed Kuru. My stomach dropped. Zara was with someone from Kuru. I couldn't believe it. It felt like a betrayal, not just to the chief, but to all of us. I should have walked away. Maybe if I had, things would have turned out differently. But instead, I ran back to the village and told one of the warriors. I didn't think much about what would happen next. I just thought the chief would handle it quietly. I thought Zara would stop seeing him, and that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The news spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, everyone knew. The chief called a meeting, and I remember standing in the crowd as he demanded to know if it was true. Zara stood in the center of the gathering, her face pale, but her chin held high. She didn't deny it. She told us his name, Amare, and said he was from Kuru. She said they loved each other and that they didn't care about the feud between our villages. The chief's face turned red with anger. He ordered Zara to stay away from Amare and sent warriors to the river to make sure no one from Kuru crossed over. But Zara didn't listen. I saw her sneaking out at night, heading toward the river. I didn't tell anyone this time. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore. But someone else must have seen her. A week later, the warriors came back with news. Zara and Amare were meeting again. This time, the chief wasn't just angry. He was furious. He sent a message to Kuru, demanding that they keep Amare away from Zara. Kuru's leader sent a message back, denying everything and accusing Matsi of trying to provoke a fight. Tensions rose quickly after that. Both villages started gathering warriors, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. I tried to keep my head down and stay out of it, but it was impossible. The whole village was on edge. Every day, more and more warriors went to the river to stand guard. Every night, I heard whispers about how the people of Kuru couldn't be trusted, how they were probably planning an attack. And then one night it happened. The first spear was thrown. I wasn't there when it started, but I saw the aftermath. The riverbank was littered with bodies, some from Matsi, some from Kuru. The river itself was stained red. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen, and it was just the beginning. Our chief, furious and grieving the loss of his warriors, declared war. Kuru's leaders did the same. Both sides believed they were in the right, and neither side was willing to back down. The feud that had simmered for generations had finally boiled over. As I stood there by the river, staring at the blood and the bodies, I realized something. This wasn't going to end anytime soon. Zara and Amare's love had ignited a fire that was about to consume us all, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But then I heard a voice behind me. It was Zara. She was crying, her face streaked with tears, and she was holding something in her hands. "It's not supposed to be like this," she said, her voice shaking. "We didn't mean for this to happen." I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know why she was talking to me. But before I could respond, she turned and ran back toward the village. And that's when I realized what she was holding, a small bundle of herbs. The kind we use to treat wounds. Zara's bundle of herbs stayed on my mind that night. I couldn't shake the image of her running back to the village, her face pale and streaked with tears. It wasn't just guilt. It was something more, like she'd seen the future and knew it was darker than we could imagine. The next morning, the drums of war echoed through Matsi. Our warriors gathered in the square, their spears and shields glinting in the sun. I wasn't a warrior, but I could feel the tension like everyone else. People whispered about revenge, about honor, about showing Kuru that Matsi wasn't weak. No one talked about Zara or Amare anymore, not openly at least. Their love had become a poison, infecting everyone's minds, fueling a hatred that had already been there, buried deep. I didn't see Zara that day. I thought about going to her hut, asking her what she planned to do, but what would I say? That I regretted telling the warrior what I'd seen? That it was all my fault? I couldn't bring myself to face her. Instead, I stayed on the outskirts of the square, watching as the chief stood before the warriors. His voice was loud, steady, and full of anger as he spoke. He told them that Kuru had crossed the line too many times, that they couldn't be trusted, that this was the only way to protect Matsi. The warriors cheered, raising their spears in the air, but I felt sick to my stomach. I kept thinking about the river, the blood, the bodies. How many more would there be before this was over? By the time the sun set, the warriors had crossed the river. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew it wouldn't end well. The rest of us stayed behind, waiting for news. The hours dragged on, and every time someone walked into the village, I held my breath, hoping they'd bring word that it was over. But when the first warrior returned, he didn't bring peace. He brought anger and fear. "They're ready for us," he said, breathing hard. Kuru's warriors were already at the river. They attacked as soon as we got there. More warriors returned throughout the night, some carrying the wounded, others dragging the dead. The village grew quieter with each body laid on the ground. People whispered in hushed voices, asking what had gone wrong, but no one had any answers. I stayed up all night, watching the fires burn low and listening to the cries of the wounded. I couldn't stop thinking about Zara. Did she know this would happen? Did she even care? The next morning, I saw her. She was walking through the village with a basket of herbs, stopping to help the wounded. No one spoke to her. They just watched her with cold eyes, their lips pressed into thin lines. I followed her to one of the huts, where she knelt beside a young warrior with a deep gash on his leg. She worked quickly, her hands steady, her face calm. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, stepping into the hut. She looked up at me, her eyes tired but full of fire. "Because someone has to," she said. Her words stung. She was right, of course. Most people in the village were too consumed by anger to think about healing. But as I watched her work, I realized something. She wasn't just tending to the wounded. She was planning something. "Zara," I said, lowering my voice, "what are you going to do?" She hesitated, her hands stilling for just a moment. Then she sighed and shook her head. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." She stood and faced me, her chin held high. "I'm going to stop this war." I stared at her, stunned. "How?" She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her basket and walked out of the hut. That night, I saw her again. She was leaving the village, heading toward the river. This time, I didn't hesitate. I followed her, keeping my distance so she wouldn't notice. When she reached the riverbank, she stopped. For a moment, I thought she was alone. But then I saw him, Amare. He stepped out from the shadows, his face as grim as hers. They spoke in hushed voices, too quiet for me to hear. But their body language told me everything I needed to know. They were planning something big, something dangerous. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but fear held me back. Before I could make a decision, I heard a sound behind me. I turned and saw a group of Matsi warriors emerging from the trees. They'd seen Zara and Amare too. One of the warriors raised his spear, his eyes locked on Amare. I knew what was about to happen, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And then, just as the warrior threw his spear, Zara stepped in front of Amare. The moment the spear left the warrior's hand, I knew things would never be the same. Zara stepped in front of Amare, her arms spread wide. The spear missed her by inches, slamming into the ground at Amare's feet. "Enough!" Zara's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. But it was like trying to calm a storm with a whisper. The warriors stood frozen for a moment, their hands gripping their weapons. Zara, the chief's daughter, wasn't just defying the warriors of Matsi. She was siding with the enemy. "What are you doing, Zara?" one of them demanded, his voice tight with disbelief. "Get away from him." "I won't," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This fighting has to stop. Someone has to end it." The warriors exchanged glances, unsure. Zara wasn't just anyone. She was their princess, their future. But to stand with a warrior from Kuru? To shield him? It was betrayal in their eyes. "This is your fault," one of the warriors shouted. "You've brought shame to Matsi." Amare stepped forward then, his body tense but calm. "She's trying to save lives. Can't you see that?" "Save lives?" the first warrior sneered. "You've already taken too much from us." Tension snapped like a bowstring. The warriors surged forward, spears raised. Amare pulled Zara behind him, his blade flashing in the moonlight. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like stone as I watched the chaos unfold. Amare didn't try to kill anyone. He dodged and parried, moving with precision. But the warriors didn't hold back. The clash of metal filled the air, and Zara's screams cut through it all. "Stop this," she cried. "Please stop." But no one listened. I was frozen, caught between fear and regret. I wanted to run, to get help, but my feet wouldn't move. And then, from the shadows, came the sound of another horn, deep, loud, and unmistakable. It wasn't from Matsi. Kuru's warriors were here. I turned to see them pouring onto the riverbank, armed and ready. At their head was a man I recognized even from a distance, Amare's father, the fiercest warrior of Kuru. "Release my son," his voice boomed, "or we'll tear your village apart." The warriors of Matsi faltered. I could see the fear in their eyes. They were outnumbered now, and the reinforcements from Kuru looked ready to spill blood. Zara stood between the two groups, her arms raised. "No more fighting," she shouted. "Please. There's been enough death." But neither side was listening. Matsi's chief, Zara's father, arrived moments later with reinforcements of his own. His face was dark with anger, his spear gripped tightly in his hand. "This ends tonight," he growled. Amare's father stepped forward, his spear pointed directly at Zara's father. "Then let it end. Here. Now. Just you and me." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and final. Zara's father didn't hesitate. He strode into the river, his warriors parting to let him through. Amare's father did the same, stepping into the water to meet him. Zara screamed, running toward her father, but one of the warriors grabbed her arm and held her back. "This isn't what I wanted," she cried, tears streaming down her face. The two chiefs squared off, their weapons raised. The river churned around them as they circled each other, their eyes locked. Then they charged. The clash was brutal and fast, each blow heavy with years of anger and pain. The sound of metal on metal echoed across the water. Everyone watched, holding their breath. Zara fell to her knees on the riverbank, sobbing. Amare tried to go to her, but the warriors blocked his path. The fight seemed to last forever, but in reality, it was over in moments. A single strike ended it. I couldn't tell who it was at first. Both men froze, their bodies tense, their weapons locked together. Then one of them staggered and fell into the water. It was Zara's father. The river turned red as his body floated downstream. Amare's father stood over him, his chest heaving, his spear dripping with blood. "No!" Zara screamed, breaking free from the warrior holding her. She ran into the water, collapsing beside her father's body. But there was no time to grieve. The warriors of Matsi, enraged by their chief's death, surged forward with a roar. The warriors of Kuru met them halfway, and the battle began in full. Amare tried to pull Zara away, shouting at her to run, but she refused to leave her father's side. And that's when it happened. An arrow flew through the air, striking Amare in the chest. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching the shaft, blood seeping through his fingers. Zara turned, her face a mask of horror. "No!" The battle raged on around them, But all I could see was Zara cradling Amare in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Amare's face was pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps as Zara held him close. Blood soaked his tunic and dripped into the river, swirling around them. "Stay with me," Zara pleaded, her voice breaking. "You can't leave me now." Amare tried to speak, but the pain was too much. His hand trembled as he reached up to touch her face. All around them, the battle raged on. Spears clashed, warriors fell, and the air was thick with the cries of the wounded. But Zara didn't notice any of it. Her world had shrunk to the man in her arms, and the life slipping away from him. I wanted to help, but what could I do? I wasn't a warrior, and even if I had been, what good would it have done? This wasn't a fight that could be won with weapons. "Zara," a voice shouted, cutting through the chaos. I turned to see one of Motsi's elders running toward her, his face a mix of fear and anger. "You have to get out of here," he said, grabbing her arm. "I'm not leaving him," Zara cried, pulling away. "You'll die here if you stay." "Then I'll die with him." The elder hesitated, his gaze flicking to the battle. Kuru's warriors were pushing Motsi's men back, their fury unmatched after the death of Amare's father. It was clear which side would win if the fighting continued. "If you want to save him," the elder said, lowering his voice, "you need to go now. Take him and run." Zara looked down at Amare, her tears falling onto his face. He was barely conscious now, his breathing faint. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Help me," she said, her voice steady. Together, they lifted Amare, one arm over each of their shoulders. It wasn't easy. He was a warrior, and his body was heavy with muscle, but they managed to drag him out of the river and into the trees. I followed them, my heart pounding. I didn't know where they were going or what they planned to do, but I couldn't just stand there and watch. Behind us, the sounds of the battle began to fade, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. Zara didn't stop until we were deep in the woods, far from the river and the bloodshed. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said, laying Amare down on the ground. Her hands shook as she tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound. Amare winced, his eyes fluttering open. "Zara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't talk," she said, her tone firm. "Save your strength." But Amare shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, his words slurring. "I tried to stop it." "It's not your fault," Zara said, her voice breaking again. "None of this is your fault." The elder knelt beside her, his expression grim. "He needs more than a bandage," he said. "If the bleeding doesn't stop, he won't make it through the night." "Then we'll find help," Zara said, determination flashing in her eyes. "There has to be someone who can save him." "There's no one," the elder said, shaking his head. "Not in Motsi, and certainly not in Kuru. You know that as well as I do." Zara's hands clenched into fists. "I won't accept that. There has to be a way." The elder sighed, his gaze softening. "There is one possibility," he said slowly. "What is it?" Zara asked, her eyes locking onto his. He hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak. "There's a healer," he said finally. "She lives far from here, in the mountains beyond the Savannah. Some say she has powers, abilities that go beyond our understanding." Zara didn't hesitate. "Then we'll go to her." "You don't understand," the elder said. "The journey is dangerous. The mountains are treacherous, and there are creatures in those woods that—" "I don't care," Zara interrupted. "If she can save him, then I'll go. No matter the risk." The elder opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. She wasn't going to change her mind. "Fine," he said, standing. "But you can't do this alone. You'll need someone to guide you." "I'll go," I said before I could stop myself. Both Zara and the elder turned to look at me, surprise flickering across their faces. "You?" Zara asked, her tone skeptical. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how foolish I must have sounded. I wasn't a warrior or a healer. I was just a boy from Motsi who had stumbled into something far bigger than himself. But I couldn't back down now. "Yes," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I know the savannah better than anyone. I can get you to the mountains." Zara studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." The elder looked less convinced, but didn't argue. "If you're going, you'll need supplies," he said. I'll gather what I can and meet you back here at dawn. But you must leave quickly, before anyone realizes you're gone." Zara nodded, her attention already back on Amare. "Hold on," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "We're going to save you." As I watched her, I couldn't help but wonder if we were already too late. The first rays of dawn broke over the savannah as we set out, the elder's words still fresh in my mind. "Stay off the main paths. If anyone from Matsi or Kuru sees you, they'll kill you both." Zara walked beside me, her face set with determination. Amare lay unconscious on a makeshift stretcher we carried between us, his breathing shallow. The elder had done his best to patch him up, but his condition was worsening. If we didn't reach the healers soon, he wouldn't survive. The savannah stretched endlessly before us, golden grass swaying in the wind. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I kept one hand on the hilt of the small knife the elder had given me, even though I doubted it would do much good against the dangers ahead. The first day passed without incident, but the silence was oppressive. Zara barely spoke, her focus entirely on Amare. I wanted to comfort her, to say something that would make this nightmare easier, but no words came. By nightfall, we reached a cluster of acacia trees and decided to rest. I gathered firewood while Zara checked on Amare, her movements quick and efficient despite her exhaustion. "Is he?" I began, but she cut me off. "He's alive," she said, not looking up. "That's all that matters." I nodded, unsure what else to say. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I sat close to it, the warmth a small comfort against the chill of the night. Zara stayed by Amare's side, her hand resting on his forehead. "We'll get there," I said finally, breaking the silence. She looked at me, her eyes unreadable. "We have to." That night, I slept lightly, every sound in the darkness setting my nerves on edge. Somewhere in the distance, a lion roared, its deep rumble carrying across the savannah. By morning, we were on the move again, the mountains looming closer with each step. The terrain grew rougher, the grass giving way to rocky ground. The sun beat down on us mercilessly, and every step felt heavier than the last. Zara never complained, even as the blisters on her feet began to bleed. She refused to let me carry Amare alone, her determination driving her forward. By the third day, the exhaustion was almost unbearable. Amare's condition had worsened, his fever was high, and his breathing was labored. "We're not going to make it," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "We don't have a choice," Zara snapped, her voice sharp. "We have to." I didn't argue. Her resolve was the only thing keeping us moving, and I wasn't about to take that away from her. That evening, as we climbed higher into the mountains, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up, whipping at our clothes. "We need to find shelter," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the wind. Zara nodded, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain. Finally, we found a small cave, just big enough to shield us from the storm. I set Amare down gently, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "He's burning up," Zara said, her voice trembling. She pulled off her shawl and soaked it in a puddle of rainwater before pressing it to his forehead. As the storm raged outside, I huddled near the entrance trying to keep watch. But my exhaustion caught up with me, and before I knew it, I had drifted off. I woke to the sound of Zara's voice, low and urgent. "Eli, wake up!" I blinked, disoriented. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was filtering into the cave. But Zara's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up. She pointed to the entrance. "Someone's out there." I strained my ears, and sure enough, I heard the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the rocky ground. "Stay here," I whispered, reaching for my knife. Zara grabbed my arm. "Be careful." I nodded and crept toward the entrance, my heart pounding. As I peered out, I saw a figure moving among the rocks. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a bow slung across his back. He was from Kuru. I ducked back into the cave, my mind racing. If he found us, we were dead. What do we do? Zara whispered, her face pale. Before I could answer, a shadow fell over the cave entrance. The man had found us. He stepped inside, his bow drawn, and an arrow nocked. His eyes landed on Zara first, then on Amare. Recognition flickered across his face. "Amare," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. Zara stepped in front of him, her arms spread wide. "Don't hurt him," she said, her voice trembling. "Please." The man lowered his bow, his expression softening. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. "I'm here to help." Zara and I exchanged a confused glance. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice wary. The man smiled faintly. "My name is Kyan. I'm Amare's uncle." Kyan's revelation hit like a thunderclap. Zara froze, her gaze darting between him and the unconscious Amare. "You're his uncle?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling. Kyan nodded, lowering his bow. "I've been looking for him since the fighting broke out. When his father fell, I feared the worst. I tracked his trail through the savannah." He glanced at Amare's motionless body, concern etched into his face. "What happened to him?" "He was injured trying to stop the battle," Zara said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're trying to get him to a healer in the mountains, but we're running out of time." Kyan knelt beside Amare, his jaw tightening as he examined the wound. "This is bad. If we don't get him to the healer soon, he won't make it." "Then help us," Zara pleaded. "You know these mountains better than we do. Please." Kyan hesitated, his eyes scanning the cave as if weighing his options. Finally he stood. "I'll guide you, but you need to move fast. The healer's home is a full day's journey from here, and the path is dangerous." Zara nodded without hesitation. "We'll go now." With Kyan leading the way, we left the cave and began climbing higher into the mountains. The terrain grew steeper, the rocks slick with rain from the storm. Every step was a struggle, the stretcher swaying precariously as we carried Amare over the uneven ground. The air grew colder as we climbed, biting at our skin. Zara stumbled more than once, her exhaustion evident, but she refused to rest. Kyan moved quickly, his experience in the mountains evident as he guided us through narrow passes and around sheer cliffs. As night fell, the path became even more treacherous. Shadows danced in the moonlight, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. At one point, Kyan stopped abruptly, raising a hand for silence. "What is it?" I whispered. He pointed ahead, his voice low. "Hyenas. They've been following us since we left the cave." My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen or heard anything, but now that he mentioned it, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on us. "What do we do?" Zara asked, her voice barely audible. Kyan unslung his bow, nocking an arrow. "We keep moving but stay close. If they attack, we won't stand a chance out in the open." The tension was suffocating as we pressed on, every step accompanied by the faint rustle of movement behind us. My grip tightened on the knife the elder had given me, though I doubted it would do much good against a pack of hyenas. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the darkness. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw a pair of glowing eyes just beyond the edge of the trail. "They're here," I whispered, my voice shaking. Kyan spun around, his arrow trained on the darkness. "Keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll hold them off." "No," Zara said, her voice firm. "We can't leave you behind." "You don't have a choice," Kyan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If I don't distract them, none of us will make it." Before we could protest further, he loosed an arrow into the darkness. A yelp followed, and the glowing eyes disappeared. Kyan turned back to us, his expression hard. "Go, now." Zara hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Kyan gave a faint smile. "Take care of him." With that, he turned and ran toward the hyenas, his bow at the ready. The sounds of growls and snarls filled the air as we hurried up the trail, the stretcher bouncing with every step. The climb was brutal, our legs burning with effort. The thought of Kyan fighting alone weighed heavily on me, but there was no time to dwell on it. Amare's life depended on us reaching the healer in time. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the peaks, we saw it. A small hut perched on the edge of a cliff, smoke curling from its chimney. Relief washed over me, but Zara didn't slow down. She sprinted ahead, her desperation giving her strength. We reached the hut and banged on the door, our voices hoarse from shouting. A moment later, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman appeared, her eyes sharp and piercing. "What is it?" she asked, her tone brisk. "Please," Zara said, tears streaming down her face. "He's dying. You have to help him." The woman's gaze shifted to Amare, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she stepped aside and motioned for us to bring him in. The hut was small and cluttered, filled with shelves of jars and bundles of dried herbs. The healer directed us to lay Amare on a low cot, then began examining him with practiced hands. "He's lost a lot of blood," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "The wound is infected. I can try to save him, but it won't be easy." "Do whatever it takes," Zara said, her voice shaking. "Please." The healer nodded and set to work, mixing herbs and boiling water over the fire. Zara and I stood by helplessly, watching as she cleaned the wound and applied a poultice. Hours passed, the tension in the room suffocating. Amare remained unconscious, his breathing shallow. Zara refused to leave his side, her hand gripping his tightly. Finally, the healer stepped back, wiping her hands on a cloth. "It's done," she said, her voice weary. "Now we wait." "Will he live?" Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The healer's expression softened. "He's strong. If anyone can survive this, it's him. But the next few days will be critical." Zara nodded, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. The healer gave a faint smile. "Rest now. You'll need your strength for what's to come." As Zara sat beside Amare, her head resting on his chest, I stepped outside the hut, the cool mountain air filling my lungs. The savannah stretched out below, bathed in the golden light of dawn. We had made it this far, but the journey wasn't over. Whether Amare would survive, or whether peace between Matsi and Kuru was still possible, remained uncertain. For now, all we could do was hope.